a gritty, dimly lit police training facility. Officers line up for an early morning combat drill, the smell of sweat and rubber mats thick in the air. Officer Daniels was used to being the center of attention. He was the type of cop who loved to show off, constantly reminding everyone of how much he knew and how tough he was. Standing at the center of the training room, cracking his knuckles with a smug smile, he enjoyed the power that came from intimidating the newer recruits. The room was full of eager eyes, all looking up to him as he flexed, showing off his muscles as if that alone was enough to earn respect. As Daniels looked around, his eyes landed on her, Officer Maya Evans. She was standing near the edge of the mat, calm, composed, and completely unbothered by the chaos of the room. Something about her presence stood out. While the others were laughing or chatting, she stayed silent, watching them with a focused intensity. At first glance, she didn't seem to fit into the mold Daniels was used to. She didn't wear the arrogance he thrived on. Instead, her posture radiated a quiet confidence, one that he wasn't quite sure how to place. The more he looked at her, the more he found himself irritated. He had to make his mark. He couldn't let someone like her come into his space and steal his spotlight. With a smirk, Daniels walked over to her. He wasn't just going to let her slip into his world without a little challenge. He needed to put her in her place. "You here to watch, sweetheart," Daniels said, his tone oozing with mockery. "'Cause this ain't exactly a yoga class." Laughter rippled through the room. The other officers exchanged amused glances. Daniels was always the alpha male, and they enjoyed watching him take control. But Officer Maya Evans didn't flinch. She didn't get defensive or flustered. She simply stood there, eyes meeting his with a calmness that felt unsettling. Then, without a word, she started to remove her jacket, revealing her tactical vest underneath. The laughter stopped. Everyone was watching now. The air shifted. It was no longer just Daniels in the spotlight. Her movements were measured, deliberate. She didn't rush, but there was an undeniable confidence in every step. As she finished removing her jacket, her eyes locked onto Daniels with an unwavering focus. The room seemed to hold its breath, and even the officers who usually laughed at his jokes were silent now. "Is there something you want to say, Officer Daniels?" she asked, her voice steady, with no hint of the nervousness he expected from someone new. Daniels' grin faltered. He had expected her to back down, to shy away, but she didn't. She wasn't just standing there for show. She was showing him something he hadn't anticipated. The air between them thickened. The room, which had once been filled with laughter and playful banter, now hummed with tension. Maya's presence was undeniable. She wasn't here to entertain Daniels or anyone else. She was here for something else. Daniels realized this was no ordinary recruit. As he squared off with her, he felt a slight unease creeping into his gut. She hadn't shown any signs of backing down, and that unsettled him. But he wasn't going to show weakness, not now, not in front of the other officers. "Where are you watching from? What time is it? Drop a comment." The training room was filled with the sound of heavy breaths and the shuffle of feet. Officer Daniels stood across from Officer Carter, his chest puffed out with overconfidence. He was the gym's golden boy, always the first to volunteer for sparring, always the one to win. In his mind, this was going to be another easy victory. "All right, Daniels," the instructor said with a smile, clapping his hands. "Since you're so eager to show off, you'll spar with—" He paused, glancing at Officer Carter, who stood calmly, waiting for the call. Officer Carter, think you can handle that?" Daniels smirked, brushing a strand of sweat from his brow. "Oh, I got this," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. He barely glanced at the woman, sizing her up in a dismissive way. To him, this was nothing. Another sparring session, just another notch on his belt. The mat felt cool beneath their feet as they took their positions. Carter stood poised, confident, yet not aggressive. Daniels lunged first, quick and eager to make a statement. He was aggressive, fast, and certain he'd land the first hit. His fist sliced through the air, but she was already one step ahead. With a fluid motion, she sidestepped, her body a seamless wave. Daniel's fist missed by mere inches. Before he could react, Carter stepped into his space, her foot sweeping out and knocking him off balance. His confidence faltered for a split second as he stumbled, but he recovered quickly, brushing it off with a snarl. "Come on, Carter," Daniels muttered under his breath. "Is that all you've got?" She didn't respond with words. Instead, she moved again, effortlessly reading his next move. This time, Daniel's wild swing was met with a sharp, calculated strike to his ribs. It wasn't enough to hurt, just enough to get his attention. The air whooshed out of his lungs as his posture buckled from the impact. The room around them had fallen silent. The other officers were watching, their eyes flickering between the two fighters. Daniels was clearly shaken, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. His next move was even faster, an all-out charge, determined to prove he was still in control. He swung wildly, a flurry of punches, his ego driving his every move. But Carter, calm, composed, dodged every one of them. She didn't even seem to break a sweat. Her movements were fluid, precise, like she was dancing around his aggression, letting him wear himself down. Daniels was frustrated now. He swung harder, faster, but each punch was countered with ease. His breath was coming faster, his arms were tiring, and his mind was beginning to cloud with doubt. Sweat streamed down his face, his pride beginning to crack. This wasn't supposed to be happening. And then, out of nowhere, Carter moved in, close. With one swift motion, she swept his legs out from under him. The world tilted as Daniels lost his balance, crashing to the mat with a thud. The wind was knocked out of him, and for a split second he couldn't breathe. The room was completely still. Daniels lay there, stunned, gasping for air. His chest heaved, his face flush with a mix of humiliation and shock. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't prepared for someone who could outthink him, outmaneuver him at every turn. Carter stepped back, unfazed, adjusting her gloves. She didn't say a word, just stood there watching him. Daniels lay on the mat for a moment, trying to catch his breath. His ego, shattered in real time, seemed to take longer to recover than his body. The silence in the room was deafening. The instructor and the other officers stared, some with surprise, others with respect. Carter had won, not by force, but by skill and precision. "All right, Daniels," the instructor said after a long moment, his voice soft. "You good?" Daniels slowly pushed himself up, avoiding eye contact with the others. His pride had taken a hit, but there was something deeper, something more humbling about the way he'd been taken down. For the first time, he truly saw how far he had yet to go. Carter extended a hand, her expression unreadable. "You all right?" she asked, her tone even, as if nothing had happened. Daniels nodded, accepting her hand. He didn't say anything, but the lesson was clear. Arrogance and pride wouldn't get him far. Not in this room, not anywhere. The room slowly returned to its normal chatter, but Daniels knew something had shifted. He'd walked into that sparring match thinking he was untouchable, but now he knew better. "Maybe next time I'll learn to listen," he muttered under his breath, still feeling the weight of his own ego lying crumpled on the mat. Carter just nodded, her focus already shifting back to the next round. "Have you ever seen someone's ego shatter in real time? Tell us below." The room is silent, the air thick with tension. Daniels, still on the ground, stares up at the woman in disbelief. The smirk on her face only makes the situation worse. "Captain." "Carter," he mutters, almost under his breath. She stands tall, her uniform pressed and crisp, a look of calm authority in her eyes. Her presence dominates the room as if she's been in charge from the very beginning, and now she's making sure everyone knows it. "Yes, Officer Daniels," she responds, her voice steady, like she's been waiting for this moment for a long time. "I think it's about time you meet me, don't you?" Daniels scrambles to his feet, wiping the dust off his uniform, his pride a little more bruised than his body. He looks around, expecting to see some form of sympathy from his colleagues, but they're all looking away, embarrassed or amused by the turn of events. The instructor, who'd been silent up until now, finally breaks the silence with a nod. "Officers, line up," he barks. "I'd like to introduce you to your new commanding officer." The words hang in the air, sharp and sudden. Daniel's stomach churns. His mind races as he tries to process everything. It doesn't make sense. How could she be here, and why is she in charge now? As the officers shuffle into formation, Daniels remains standing there, unsure of what to do. Captain Carter, however, is calm and composed, walking toward the front as if this were a routine drill. She turns to face the group, her gaze sweeping over everyone in the room, but her eyes land on Daniels last. The silence lingers for just a beat too long before she speaks. "Any more smart comments, Officer Daniels?" she asks, a quiet challenge in her voice. Her tone is professional, but there's an edge to it that sends a shiver down Daniel's spine. For a moment, Daniels just stares at her. His face flushes with a mix of anger and embarrassment. He wants to say something, but the words stick in his throat. What can he say? What can he do in front of his fellow officers, knowing that this woman just completely obliterated him in front of everyone? He opens his mouth, but the words don't come. The room feels suffocating. His reputation, the one he'd built over the years, feels fragile, about to crack under the weight of this very moment. Captain Carter doesn't wait for him to answer. She turns her back on him, facing the group of officers now assembled in front of her. "I hope we can all move forward, working together," she says, her voice firm. "This is a new chapter for all of us, and I intend to make sure we all do our best to protect and serve." Daniels wants to argue. He wants to remind her that he's been doing this job for longer than she's probably been in the force. But he knows better. He can see it in her eyes. This isn't a fight he can win. Not now. Not with her in charge. And as she continues with her briefing, giving orders and laying out expectations for the department, Daniels's mind begins to shift. He can't keep thinking of her as the woman who humiliated him. He has to learn to respect her, because she's clearly earned it. And maybe, just maybe, there's something to learn from this. Something he's been blind to all these years. As the meeting comes to a close, Daniels knows he'll have to swallow his pride and work with her. He doesn't have a choice now, but that doesn't mean he'll forget what happened today. Because Maya Carter, the woman who just wiped the floor with him, has officially claimed her spot at the top. What would you do in Daniel's shoes? Should he swallow his pride or keep pushing back? Let us know what you think. Days passed, and Officer Daniels was different. The brash, overconfident cop who once walked into every room like he owned it now kept his head low. His steps were slower, measured. The cocky smirk he used to wear had been replaced with a more contemplative expression. He'd made mistakes, big ones, and he knew the weight of his actions would follow him. Since the incident with Captain Carter, Daniels hadn't spoken much to anyone. His colleagues gave him space, some with sympathy, others with coldness. He was the same officer, but something about him had shifted, something intangible. He wasn't as eager to jump to conclusions anymore. Captain Carter, on the other hand, had long since moved on. She wasn't here to prove herself to anyone. She was here to lead, and lead she did. Her professionalism, her calm demeanor, her confidence, it wasn't just a facade, it was her foundation. She carried herself with a strength that was undeniable, a strength that was recognized not only by her team but by everyone who worked under her command. She didn't need validation. She had earned it. In the days following the tense moment, Captain Carter had shown nothing but grace. She didn't bring up the incident again. She didn't rub it in Daniel's face. Her work spoke for itself. She continued to lead with integrity and respect, keeping the department running smoothly. But Daniels felt the sting of his own failure. The words he had spoken, the assumptions he had made, they haunted him in the quiet moments when he wasn't busy with calls. He hadn't even thought about it then. The way he had looked at Captain Carter, the way he'd belittled her in front of everyone, was now impossible to ignore. It wasn't just her he'd disrespected, though. He had disrespected himself, too. Daniels had prided himself on his ability to make snap judgments, to rely on gut instinct. But now, the truth had settled like a weight in his chest. His gut instinct had been wrong, and because of that, he'd failed. He'd been a victim of his own biases, and worse, he'd let them slip into his professional life. Captain Carter didn't need to tell him what he'd done wrong. He already knew. His actions had already spoken louder than any words could, and now there was nothing left to do but reflect. Daniels didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to make excuses. He just accepted the consequences. His reputation had taken a hit, and there was nothing he could do to undo the damage. The one thing he could do was to learn from it, to make sure it never happened again. He still worked the streets, still wore his badge, but something had changed. He was quieter now, more observant. He listened more, judged less. When he spoke, his words were more deliberate, careful not to assume anything about anyone. Captain Carter's leadership had left an impression on him, one that he would carry forward. As for her, she didn't care for apologies. She didn't care for power struggles or petty vindications. She was there to do her job, and she did it well. The fact that Daniels had learned a lesson, even if it came at a cost, was enough for her. In the end, respect isn't something that can be demanded. It has to be earned. And she had earned it. Daniels? He had a long road ahead. He would never forget the lesson he'd learned from Captain Carter, one that would change his approach to his work, his relationships, and his understanding of himself. Respect wasn't given. It was earned. And it was something he would work to regain, one step at a time. What do you think? Should Daniels get a second chance? Or did he get what he deserved? Let us know.